Uh, Dr. Taher Youssef is someone who loves encouraging others to take an intentional role in kingdom missions, both domestically and internationally. Founder of Holistic Health International, a nonprofit that equips people to think deeply about God's holistic and integrative approach towards reaching people and nations through our body, soul, and spirit. Taher has been attending and serving through the Mission Connection Conference since 2014 and is excited for what God has in store for each attendee through this time together. We'll, at the end of the lecture, we'll take questions and speak with people. If you would leave your questions in the chat, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Well, it's great to be with all of you this afternoon, right in the middle of the day. Many of you, as the introduction started, you must really have a heart for the persecuted church and many countries that continue to go through horrific situations that we certainly, as the bride in the North American context, need to be at least aware of, and hopefully out of that awareness can be part of some sort of encouragement, prayer, maybe even work, and outreach towards many of our brothers and sisters in different parts of the world. So let me go ahead and just start sharing my screen with you. Sorry about the delay. Hopefully you can see that the very first slide here. So just to give you a quick outline of our time together, I know that many of you, even as the introduction started, it's not the lack of awareness, but perhaps a desire to deepen our hearts and align it with what God has in store. I've had the privilege, in way of introduction, working with an organization that has worked among the Afghans for the past 23 years. And I started working with them about 12 years ago now. And just recently have gone into a part-time position with them, mainly to do more training, especially within the health and holistic health arena. And that's really my medicine and public health is my background, and that's really the passion with which I got into this type of work, community development. So many of you might have an anticipation, a specific idea of what we might end up covering, or what you would like to hear. But I would like to, after a brief introduction, just really share some stories with you, and even look at the scripture with you, and see whether we could be challenged to do certain things differently in terms of how we uphold our brethren around the world who are going through difficult circumstances. So as we think about the persecuted church, certainly in this new century that we're living in, these are 10 countries that sort of top the list in the current context in terms of persecution, specifically towards Christians. But I would think that much of what's happening in as you can see, most of it within a religious, maybe even a Muslim Islamic setting, is really deeply rooted within fanaticism, within self-righteousness, movement towards cleansing of people and places, if you will. And that's what really leads to the type of tension that you see in many places. I also am reminded through various conversations that I've had over the years, and some of my own experience, that sometimes when we see a list like this and we begin to pray and God moves in a powerful way, we begin to then see places from this this list possibly getting into another list of open countries. So such a good example of such a situation like that could be as we think through many of the African countries of the 20th century. Maybe South Korea is a really good example of civil unrest and quite a lot of chaos and hopelessness, which has turned around in the span of 30, 40 years, have now become one of the most sending countries. Some statistics even say that it's even more than the U.S. Perhaps another good example is Albania, and I'm reminded of this from one of my colleagues who actually heads up the group that I now work part-time with, and he used to tell us stories about in the late 70s or mid to late 70s, taking in or sneaking in Bibles into Albania, only to see within a matter of 10 to 15 years the country open up and open up seminaries and evangelistic activities throughout the nation, and it's just completely changed the very spiritual atmosphere of the nation. So let me say that as an encouragement. Perhaps in a matter of a few years, if not, whatever God has in store, it'd be great to see some of these countries that we see on this list turn around and make it into another list. Sorry, I just saw a title there that would have been a mistake. So because of my context in the middle of this map, I'm going to share some stories with you that's going to come out of this area. And it's during my medical school days, about 22 years ago, that this country in the middle was going through possibly its darkest days under the Taliban regime. But then, even when we look at the history of this Central Asian context of the country, it used to be in the 60s and 70s, even to the late 70s, considered as a very stable, very prosperous nation. And it was even, there was a moniker that stated that Afghanistan was the Switzerland of Central Asia. It's really difficult to even fathom that now, given the 50 years of civil unrest that this country has been experiencing. And that's hard to even comprehend, because there are close to 2 generations of people who've grown up without having recognized or experienced stability in this country. Let me start off with one story that would hopefully give you a context of the mindset and how we could be part of God's work in shifting that mindset. We don't need to do that job. Certainly, it's a job of the Holy Spirit, but we could be vessels that are used to facilitate that type of movement. So here's a very rural area in the outskirts of Kabul city, maybe only about an hour and a half away from the city. And after a good 3 hours of 3 months of setting up certain health classes and asking for 6 community health workers from this very village setting, when my 2 colleagues and we got there to start the first day of classes, which would have ended up being the next 6 days, we saw no one. No one showed up, and we ended up meeting up with this the tribal leader, who then started asking us various questions and pointing to me. This is back in the days, probably late 2009, when I was still, like my medical colleague here, wearing Western garb. I didn't necessarily think that this was too rural for me to put on a local garb like this older gentleman is. But after kind of hearing about my background and why we were here, we started walking down this valley, up the mountain, and this older gentleman just started. I'm going to go ahead. Okay. He just started turning back to me. Just started just berating me, asking me questions about what are you doing here? What gives you the right to come to our nation and just wreck it? What's your military doing here? Um, do you not understand the difficulty that my people are going through? And just continuous, just a sequence of questions for a good 10 minutes or so. I was getting concerned about this elderly man as we are hiking up this mountain to. I didn't realize where we were going. We ended up getting to the house of another tribal elder. It turns out that this entire community that has about 3,300 or so people are led by these three men sitting to the side of this first man's house. And this is a gentleman that escorted us there. And this guy, the third tribal elder, made it to the meeting. I didn't even know that we were having a meeting with all the prominent three main elders of the community. This man shows up and says, and he excused himself, saying, "I'm so sorry that I'm late. I had a dispute that I had to take care of. These two guys who were just fighting over a land issue just wouldn't shut up, and I ended up shooting one of them." And I said to myself, "Man, just be careful what you say to this man." And he was calm and collected the entire time, didn't speak, maybe because of the whole shooting incident. He did clarify himself and say that I just shot him in the leg. But it's really interesting the type of situations that these guys deal with on a daily basis. And this man ended up being like a shaman, a local shaman who gives both the spiritual sort of covering and also a bit of a health holistic covering. So him and I, we talked quite a bit about the local remedies that he comes up with and the type of prayers that he prays with people that comes to see him. And this guy, as you can probably tell just from his face, is just quite a character. And I'm still kind of trying to figure out why he was just full of questions and just berating me. Had never seen me before, and all this stuff, and without asking many questions, just had nothing but negative things to say. At the end of about 2.5 hours, they're now pressing us to stay for lunch and stay for the entire day, as it is very customary for people to host and be very kind to guests. We excuse ourselves because we need to make it back to the city, but not without a few hours of really great interaction. On the way down from this man's house, the original elder, um, yeah, I just quickly want to point out the younger generation. They were just, as it is again, very customary, just sitting and listening. Turned out that one of them, I can't remember which one it is now that it's been about a year ago. I mean, sorry, 10 years ago that this story took place. Um, I actually spoke a little bit of English, but not too much. But again, we made our way down, and as soon as I got into the truck after the hike down the mountain, this original, tribal elder just kind of um, reached into the truck and grabbed my hand very, very firmly and pulled me towards him and said, "Thank you so much for listening to me. You have a gentle heart, or you have a heart of gold, um, and I appreciate you giving me the time to just." He didn't quite say, just um, let me just vent or something, but essentially that's what he was alluding to. And in my own mind, I wondered whether I had much of a choice, but really glad what he saw was different from what was really going on deeper down in my spirit, if you will. And he went on to say, anytime you guys want to come back, we will have the community health workers ready for you. This entire community is just open to you and any work that you want to do. And it's great to now look back at those 10 years, 6 months later. We actually started a health work in that community. And it's going on even now, even after we actually stopped clinic work. This community health work is continuing because it doesn't take a lot of effort other than some training, that we can continue to empower the local workers to continue to do what they need to do. So I want to take that story and just give you a bit of context from this model that I've been continuing to think through and expanding on in terms of both the community development work that I've been part of and the training bit of the work that I continue to do. So it's way before medical school that I started thinking about what would it be like for God? What kind of definition would God have for health? Health for us. What would complete health or holistic, integrated health look like? And this thought and this prayer, season of prayer about that question, led me to the great commandment. You love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love others as you love yourself. And maybe a good 5 years or so after I started thinking about it, writing more about it, meditating on it, I came across my favorite passage in the whole Bible is Philippians 4. And as I began to decipher it, as I was studying for some particular matter, I can't remember now, I realized, wow, this four areas of physical and emotional, mental, and spiritual aspect is reflected um, within this passage as well. And just so happens that we can actually read the entire Bible as the Great Commandment is a summary of this love that we can develop for God, for ourselves, and others. And it's good that we have that hierarchy, if you will, or that sequence of loving God, loving ourselves, and loving others. And I would say that's something that I've been thinking through much more in terms of how do we truly develop a method, if you will, um, to have the type of impact that we're hoping to have. And this is much more of a personal reflection and a personal benefit. And then what comes out of that is something that just God does, I think. And so as I began to think about it, I'm sure you've all seen an aspect of this in various, whether it's leadership studies or theological studies or any sector of life, really. When I was talking to a young mother from that very same community that I shared the story from, and I happened to ask the wrong question to this lady about why her young daughter, who was with her, who was probably around 11 or 12 years old, why she was not in school. The lady looked at me completely dumbfounded, um, as if I was from a different planet. And that made me realize the belief system that essentially what the lady said was, what good is it to me if my daughter goes to school? Made me realize that the lack of awareness this lady has about her own health is now simply going to transfer to her young daughter. Maybe within a matter of 5 years, this young girl will also become a mother, and she will then transfer that same sort of paradigm, that same sort of belief system, the lack of depth and understanding and the wisdom, I would say, and therefore not having enough knowledge to really think through in your mind and emote through that in order to then assess the actual data that's all around us, information, what tends to be the behavioral patterns that we see around us. So that has, I'm just explaining this model, which might be of help as we look at the parable as well, and also as we think through what is our role in the world where we continue to see a lot of disparity. In another workshop that Mike and I we were doing yesterday, I happened to mention about um, how much this model has really meant to me, and especially in difficult circumstances when um, when we get into areas where we're not necessarily comfortable with, but then we forget that it is really the Spirit of God in us that is doing the transformative work. So don't strain your eyes too much reading all the small letters here. All I want you to consider here is the arrows in the middle of this paradigm. I tend to consider these as intersections of who we are, from the physical aspect of who we are, which is so quantifiable, measurable. We go into the semi-quantifiable, qualitative aspect of emotions, will, consciousness, or mental acuity. And then there's this deeper aspect that's not quantifiable, not qualifiable. It's unmeasurable. This is spiritual aspect. So I have that. If any of you want to have this slide set, I do have that in a little bit more readable format here. So let's now take these three aspects of who we are. This is obviously seen so well in the Trinity, isn't it? A perfect unity between Jesus, God the Father, and the Holy Spirit, three in one, living such a united, um, um, or being a united being, and having a united front. And so let me see whether we could get into, actually, it's slightly better for me to leave it in this format. I would like to see whether we could look at this parable together. This is actually one of my favorite parables. After going in and out of Afghanistan for about 12 years, 12 times, 4 years, the very last trip that I took in late 2012 ended up being a very difficult one, where the two of my Afghan colleagues and we were held captive for 5 days. And the only reason why I'm able to, um, share these stories and continue to live is because of the kindness and the very difficult, incredible work of the American Navy SEALs. Unfortunately, the first SEAL that walked into the room where I was being held, and at that time, by then, 12 hours prior to my rescue, my two colleagues were separated and taken to a completely different village. And luckily, they were rescued by the Afghan army, almost similar time to when I was being rescued by the SEALs. The first SEAL that walked in was killed, and it just all, um, uh, while it was successful from my aspect, from my perspective, it was not very successful for the five men that were holding me that night, and the guys in the house that were giving us the room to, sparing the room for us to live in that night, and many more who died as a result of being part of this hostage situation. But I mentioned that because in spite of some of the good conversations and not so good conversations, I've been able to see the way the Spirit of God presents Himself, um, and really helps all of us, myself included, to think slightly differently from the way we are accustomed to think. And I mentioned that also because it took me that type of a situation, in the hostage situation, for me to realize, wow, I through some of the very meaningful interactions with some of these guys. Sorry, my dog is making. Sorry about that. It took me a situation like that to realize the heart of the Father, even to the unrighteous or the righteous, the evil and the good. And so much of this is subjective, isn't it? Because our righteousness can't hold much to God's measure, and that's exactly why we have the reference of Christ and His salvation through Him. So, in that context, I want to look at this parable and see whether we can not only apply this model, but also apply some of our desires in terms of how we even view the people that might be persecuting our brethren. And as a result of a shift in our mindset, I wonder whether we could be more effective in the way we pray, in the way we reach out, um, in the way we simply reflect God's light to the world that's desperately looking for it. So you all know the story. Man with two sons, the younger son comes and says, "Father, give me my share of the estate." Not too long after that, the younger son takes off and squanders all of that in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country. He began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. So at this point, he comes to his senses, and I would refer to this as one of those transformative intersections in his life where he comes to realize that how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death. And so he set out to go back to his father, and he is now practicing this little speech. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. That same thing that we talked about in terms of the great commandment. There's a father, there's ourselves and others, the three characters that are represented throughout the Bible. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way away, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. I have to pause here and say that it's easy for all of us from a Western perspective to read the story through our Western lenses. You know, I spent the first close to 15 years of my life in two different parts of India before I moved to a country called California, not too far from many of you guys where you guys are at. And I actually only spent about 12, 13 years in California before I left. I was in England for a little while. And when my wife and I headed back to the States, we actually have been in Colorado for the last 14 years or so. And I say the country of California because every place in the US is so distinct. It has its own sort of culture. Yeah, we might be united with the language, but the culture is different, and the way we see things is different. The way we speak, maybe the type of dialect, perhaps, and our customs, mores, traditional ways of doing things is probably different. And one of the things that was really meaningful for me is trying to read and reread the parables through the filter of the Eastern mindset. Although I should have that, right, having grown up in India. But I would say most of my paradigm building worldview setting really happened as a teenager in California and beyond. And sometimes I have to be intentional about reading a story like this and realizing how much this is a kingdom story and how much this doesn't necessarily happen even in the culture that Christ is speaking into. As Christ is talking about this, he's talking to the younger son set and the older sons category, the Pharisees, the self-righteous ones, and the tax collectors, people who would be so despised, would not even be looked at, would be spat upon, right? The sinner and the saint, so to speak. And yet Christ is putting all of them in the same level playing field. And the fact that the Father runs to him simply does not happen. Perhaps even in the Western setting, and there are some very forgiving fathers who would do that, but the father would simply wait for the son to come towards him in an Eastern setting, and not leave his posture of power, his hierarchy, and all that. So this is a completely different type of father, and certainly the heart of the Father, the Heavenly Father, that we'll get to see through this story that Jesus is sharing. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And before he could continue with the rest of his speech, the father stops him and says, quick, bring the best robe. So that will be his own robe, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. And here we come to the third um, section of this story. This is when the older son comes back after a hard day in the fields. And when he came close, he's hearing music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, what's going on? And so the servant says, your brother has come and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. One of my dear friends always reminds me that that fattened calf would have belonged to the older son. You know, you that same story that I shared with you early on as we were sitting in that little room, the living room of that Afghan elder. There was this one time as we were talking about lunch and then dinner, although we didn't have any of that, the promise was that he just pointed out to a rooster making noise in the field and said, see that rooster right there? That is going to be our lunch next time you visit us. So there is this aspect of saving things for seasons on end, perhaps even a few years, to save that and to kill, in this case, a fattened calf for the right occasion. And certainly the father thought that this was good enough occasion, but the older brother certainly didn't agree with that. He became very angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. Here's that other occasion where fathers in this Eastern setting do not leave their position and go out. It's very considered very, having had a lot of these rural feasts that I've been part of in the 4 years that I've traveled in and out of this in Central Asian context. It's really nice to see the father being the center. He's the host. He's in the center of in Afghanistan. You're actually all sitting on the floor, and you have this mat that's laid out, and these cushions that you sit on, and you essentially end up eating naan, which is the local bread, thick bread, and that becomes your main utensil that you use to scoop up rice or many different things. And in some cases, there might be spoon, especially if they know that it's a foreigner among them. And there are utensils to serve things, but not necessarily to eat with. Um, but anyway, I say that because the father is always the center of the party. He never leaves that position. So this father again goes out and meets the older son. Um, and the older son is saying, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and I've never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who have squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. And I love the father's reply here. My son, you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Let me take a moment to, again, I'm sure that you've heard this story so many times, but let me take a moment to use the story in the context of the persecuted church. You know, in this type of context, it would be the self-righteous older brother who would be the ones who are part of local fundamental movements, orthodoxy, the dogma that needs to be carried out so that their social construct is not, uh, you know, tainted with. And so this reminds me of Tim Keller's book, The Prodigal God, that makes very distinct mention of how there are so many older brothers in all cultures that stop younger brothers who have come to their senses from truly being part of a family, a society, a church, a process of reconciliation. And where this story becomes difficult for us, if it's really challenging us, is when we see ourselves in the shoes of the older brother. And Christ, as he's saying this, keep in mind that he is representing, he's essentially saying that the Pharisees, the religious zealots of the day, the elders of the church, of your local church, or the pastors, or the deacons, essentially represent. And I'm not necessarily saying that all of us who are in positions like that need to be in this position, but if we find ourselves in that position, that's a very challenging, as it should be, a challenging place to find ourselves, because there are many people waiting to come back to the fold of the Father, to be in the presence of the Father, do not necessarily want power, prestige, title, as this younger brother says. I simply want to be like one of your hired servants. So with that premise in mind, let me share another story with you. I believe this is in middle of 2010, that I had the privilege of, see if I can move this a little bit so you can see this a little better. I had the privilege of going all the way closer to the Pakistan border. And this is a province called Nangarhar, and you've perhaps heard about a city called Jalalabad. Historically, this is a very prominent place where I wouldn't be surprised if a few millennia ago, as was the case with the Syrian exile of the Jewish people, there are many synagogues in this place. Many Jews who have later on, as being part of this culture, converted to and become Islamists and Muslim followers. And so we came to this village, and as I think through the story of the parable of the prodigal son, I think of this entire people group. They're called the Momons. They're the subgroup of the Pashtun, one of the prominent groups within Afghanistan, also in the north-south western frontier of Pakistan. Unfortunately, as the English colonial whole movement kind of were dividing. They were dividing the land and the geographical locations, boundaries. It unfortunately went through right smack in the middle of Pashtun people. So they're divided between the east and west of the two borders of Afghanistan and Pakistan. So as we got there, they were showing us this great barren land where they wanted to construct a community center and set up a few training, both in the medical and leadership arena. And that led to us having a great conversation. Essentially, what they were saying is that we have tried everything. We've been part of the Mujahideen uprising to take down the Russians. Then we've even fought with the Taliban. And we've tried everything that we can, but our people are simply not progressing. So essentially, the same stance that the younger brother in this prodigal son story came to their senses, and they said, we want you guys to guide us in a process that would take us to a better life for us and our community and our families, our wives, our children. We want a better future. It was such a great, life-giving conversation to be part of. And this is still back in the days I used to take a lot of pictures. I stopped doing that. And in some ways, I regret a little bit because the latter half of my 2 years of my trip, I don't have any pictures to share with anyone. The first 2 years, I took enough to remind myself of some of the great stories. And when I obviously see these pictures, I being reminded to pray for them as well. And so it's such a hot, humid, dry sort of season, and we're in this nice little shade in the middle of the field, and we have food being brought in after a couple of hours of conversation. Food being brought in from the houses nearby. Um, and it's kind of unfortunate that in spite of our model at that time were to actually put together brick and mortar, um, a setup to then do health education, leadership seminars, and various things. And that never happened. But luckily, the interaction with this entire community, I don't know how much you can actually make out the fact that this man actually lost one of his legs during one of the fights. I was just reminded of that as I was seeing him up close here. Um, and so just a picture of hopelessness. They've tried everything. Now they really want to set themselves up for a bit more of success. So, in the context of the persecuted church, these guys, these this entire tribe, would be the ones who would persecute people of people who want to be free, just shake themselves out of the shackles of the culture, a lack of freedom, right? But this conversation really, even to this day, reminds me of even the ones that are persecuting others, how, because of their own hopelessness, how open they are, not only for the conversation, but for the hope of Christ to just really be immersed into their context. Because what they're crying out for is a better future for themselves, their families, their entire community. In this case, it's probably close to a few thousand people that they call their close knit tribe. Um, and when salvation enters a context like that, it's so nice because it's the entire tribe that then enters into the salvation story. I leave this last picture here because it was so funny. At the end of it was very similar to the other conversation that I had and a few others that I've had to the elders. The young guys don't speak at all, right? At the end, and they were so shy, but they just kind of tugged on my coat and in perfect English started speaking to me. And I was about to blurb out that, why didn't you guys speak up while we were talking for the last 3 hours? But I didn't, because they have a place. They know the way it works in that culture, and they wouldn't speak out of turn and unless they're spoken to. And certainly I had my medical colleague who was doing all the translation for the conversation we were having anyway. But as I look at these youngsters, and especially within this context of persecution and lack of freedom and lack of liberty for even these guys, if they happen to hear the greatest story ever told, their own family members will turn on them. And that has really led us to a lot of activities among the young generations, whether it is literacy, biblical principles being spoken into many of the classes that we, take them through, with the hope and prayer. Sometimes we've gotten into trouble and we've had to close down centers for a long time until the sort of the heat subsides a bit. Um, and I say all of this to remind and perhaps challenge all of us, um, that even in the context of very tense, um, culture issues that are happening uh, in a given country, some of the things that we end up doing, and I don't want to highlight the specific activities, but if we go deeper into that non-measurable, deeper spiritual matters, which Jesus was so good at getting at, wasn't he? Because essentially, in all the parables, he was just introducing a new way of thinking, a new way of emoting, new way of carrying oneself, thinking about the kingdom of God um, coming to earth. So I think in that regard, whatever we end up doing, it's not that we have to highlight the activities per se, but if it's strategically thought through and desired to be a vessel to promote the kingdom activities, then it becomes such an amazing transformative effort for the people that we work in. So I would encourage you in the sense that even in settings, as I said in the very beginning, even in settings where we have a list of countries, let me just quickly go back to that list. And there are many people who are praying for North Korea, just waiting for that regime to sort of collapse. And even now, so many South Koreans kind of parachuting different food, um, Bible material over the border, so to speak. Um, I would say in Afghanistan, what we did not even anticipate over the past few decades have begun to happen in the last 5 years. Um, there are now networks of believers, not just few believers, network of believers mentioned in every single one of the 34 provinces throughout the country. And to think back to some of the original workers from the 60s, 70s, like J. Christie Wilson, and many others who have followed those footsteps, and some of the nonprofit work that has happened, leadership, now a lot of underground stuff that's been going on, and obviously churches and fellowships are still all underground, obviously, but some of the stuff that's happening among the locals is powerfully um, kingdom oriented and explosion of God's kingdom in countries where we would not even anticipate or uh, even dream about. So I would say, for example, in Pakistan, they continue to move more and more towards fundamentalism, and yet there are um, state churches and these charismatic evangelistic fellowships that's springing out everywhere. Um, so in spite of the persecution, God has actually left his light through either new believers. In Pakistan, I continue to hear that although there's new movements happening, much of what continues to be Christian, quote unquote, is really a representation of the older brother in the story of the parable of the prodigal son. And that's really unfortunate because we have a system in place. Anyone who sort of does not quite fit into that system is considered not worthy of the Father's love, the Father's celebration, Father's heart. Um, so I hope in the context of the holistic model, in the context of this parable, as we look at situations like this, even in our own country, um, when we come across people that don't necessarily fit into that mold that we're comfortable with, we're likely to see them as outsiders. It doesn't quite fit our theological framework or whatever it might be, even Christian cultural framework. I hope that really, I know it challenges me when I start thinking in that sense, and I hope it challenges you, even when you think about what could be the very root causes of why persecution continues to happen, and what are we as a Western Church of the Bride on this side of the hemisphere doing in terms of equipping, empowering, sustaining the lives of many, many people who continue to suffer, and praying for them and encouraging them in helping them look more towards that spiritual, eternal prospect rather than maybe our methodologies, if you will. So let me stop my talk at this point. I'd love to see whether there are specific questions we could or discussion points that we could bring up as a result of what we've all just heard. Mike, you want to go ahead and facilitate that? Mike, you are muted.
Sorry.
No worries.
It always helps to be able to hear what people are saying. Please, if you have any questions, please unmute yourself and feel free to ask any questions. Remember that you'll need to remute yourself after the question. What have you heard about God doing in Eritrea?
You know, I actually don't have a big understanding of what's happening there, but I could find out for you and let you know. Is there anyone from our group that might know anything about what God is doing in Eritrea?
I have known a few believers in Eritrea. They're all underground. I believe a lot of the Christians who are on the border with Eritrea are calling now home because they're able to call across the border now.
And it's also from that list, very sad to see almost, 50% in that list are countries that would have, in the first century or in the beginning stages, would have had some presence of gospel story making its impact in those settings. So we've come a full circle in that sense.
I don't have a question, but I would like to thank you for bringing to light the way the Lord works in Afghanistan, because we have no idea. But we know that the Lord is always working underneath the ground somehow, where the roots are.
Yeah.
And that's very encouraging. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, Aurora. Just for encouragement, I would also say, one of the, after God sort of closed that door, I haven't been able to go back into Afghanistan, but I ended up being able to work with a few folks in Delhi to start an Afghan refugee school. And one of my trips, as we were considering and praying about a new project there, on my flight back, I started listing all the Afghan evangelists that I knew at that time. And this is dating back to maybe early 2016. And I was able to come up with a list of about, I want to say 18 or 19 full-time Afghan evangelists. And I realized more than half of them had come to know the Lord in Delhi. And that was a great confirmation for me to start, be part of starting an Afghan work in that city. So many times we only know so little of what obviously the big picture that God is unfolding. And I would say 4 years later, I have the privilege of connecting with so many various Afghan evangelists full-time, both in Afghanistan and in the diaspora. And I can imagine if I know or know of about 50, I'm hoping that at least there's double that number. And these are full-time Christian workers. May the Lord, bring up more pastors, apostles, and evangelists and teachers in that context so they could really feed their own sheep.
I have a comment. I stumbled onto a book called In the Land of Blue Burqas, and you may have heard of it. It's a fascinating read, In the Land of Blue Burqas. It's about a lady who was in upper management here in corporate US that served in Afghanistan as in an NGO that she didn't name. But she gave some very insightful views into the life of especially the women in Afghanistan. She was able to get their ear. They spent lots of intimate time together. And it's a fascinating read, even if you're not a Christian.
Mhm.
And as a Christian, she relates some of the questions that they asked her. So as a Christian, you could stop reading at that point and say, now, what would I have said?
Mm.
Some of the questions are very difficult. And she told her Afghan ladies, I will have to go study that, but I will bring you an answer back.
Mhm.
But again, in the land of blue burqas, it's about this lady in Afghanistan. You'll find it fascinating, I'm sure.
Yeah, Joe, I'll be happy to pass that comment on to the author. I happen to know her, very, very dear friend. I'm sure it'll be an encouragement to her as well.
Well, I've recommended it to, I live in a retirement building here, and there's 38 people, probably 6 or 8 people have read it. And one lady even said, oh, I like it so much, I'm going to buy several of my own copies to pass around.
Oh,
And I
that's
said,
great.
never mind, I have several copies. I'm trying to downsize. You keep that copy.
That's great. Yeah, unless people write about some of these stories, the Acts of the Apostles wouldn't be expanded, isn't it? I mean, we have so many stories that I'm sure we will hear about when we get to heaven. But I'm so glad for people like that who have taken their time to author some of this stuff.
I take it there must be quite a few Afghans in India then. Are they mostly in Delhi, and how many are there?
There's no specific number, Gerald, but there are some counts that state that maybe it's closer to 50,000 at a given time. But not all of them are settling as refugees, and they are, India is sort of like a holding place. They would like to move on to either, somewhere in the Western hemisphere. Um, and yes, they are mainly in Delhi, although in the last 5 years or so, and this has been happening going back to the 60s and 70s, but the Taliban and pre and during and post Taliban, there's been more movement. Um, but yeah, they're also spreading around the world, which is one of the reasons why the Afghan bride has been growing over the past decade more than we've seen in the past 1500 or I would say 1,000 years of uh, um, Muslim presence among Afghans, which is amazing what God is doing now among them.
How are they received in India? Or do they kind of keep in their own community and learn English or Hindi or what?
Yeah, that's a good question. They are not received too well. If you know a little bit about the Mughal Empire that ruled India for 500 years, they were Afghan emperors, Turkic emperors, Persian, and so after ruling India and then having the colonial power rule India, now some of the Afghans are coming back as refugees. So it's the whole cycle kind of coming back around right now, as other than being rulers, now they're being refugees. So luckily there are some churches that have begun to work among them, but Afghans also kind of keep to themselves because they don't want to settle in India, and unfortunately that entire timeline has been taking them because of all the refugee movement. It's been taking them a long time to get resettled. And so their time in India might very well be over a decade. So it's a very difficult time. There are now 4 different fellowships in southern part of Delhi, of the city, where Afghans are coming freely to worship God. And they then get some sort of persecution from the local Afghan imams and other fundamental factions of that community. So it's really interesting what's happening there. But because of the freedom that they have, they're exploring faith matters much more than they would have in their own homeland.
Can you tell us a little more about the school?
The school started about 5 years ago, close to 5 years ago, and we have close to 75 students. And because of COVID, it's gone down a little bit. We started with 4 believing students who were coming from the believing families, and they were harassed to no end. And it took a little while for the staff to really get on top of it. 2 of the 4 believing students left during that time because it was very difficult for them to cope with that. Few years later, having done a lot of discovery Bible studies and life discovery groups, we call it, we now have 27 believing students in the school, and we just kind of make it a point to say, hey, if you want to come, you can come. If you don't want to come, you don't need to. You have complete freedom to choose. But this is, at least before this current government, it's considered a secular nation. So you will have India being a birthplace of many religions. That's something that they have to get used to anyway. So that's been very good in that sense, to be able to kind of promote a different way of paradigm and mindset to these young students. And then we get to kind of explore conversations with families as well. So while providing, we just had our first graduation in April of 2020. So we graduated 4 students, and we give a GED and a local Indian certification alongside, so they can choose if the family is getting out to somewhere in the Western country. Hopefully, GED comes useful. If they continue to stay in India, they can use that with certification. So it's been a good platform to reach out to the diaspora. And some of these guys end up going somewhere else, and if they become believers, that's a great way of expanding that kingdom wherever they go.
Wonderful. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? I think.
Do you know if any of the Afghans who left for the West, if they became Christian, or is there churches?
Yes, in fact, I know of a Christian Afghan in the Portland area. There are many Christian fellowships. One in the South, Mississippi, has an Afghan fellowship happening right now. There are many pockets. Colorado Springs, where I live, have 82 Afghan families. I happen to know 4 Afghan believers who are gathering together to pray and bring more to the fold. There are Afghan fellowships in Canada, a huge contingency in Finland, Austria, Germany. Over the past decade, we have now seen the bride growing among the Afghans literally around the world. Yeah, yes, amen. Praise God. So that's one of the reasons why I used the name that I used, but I'm just going to go ahead and type here. If you want to check out, since I believe it was Joe, who was already part of the group, who mentioned about the land of the blue burqas. Here's another book that you can read to get a different context about the Taliban and the people of Afghanistan. Type that up in the chat. Should we take one more question? And I think there might be, well, there might be a break after this, but I can't remember.
I didn't get your text. I suspect you actually had it to specific. So.
Oh, sorry. I might have typed it too. Oh, okay. Here we go. Oh, it actually ended up going to one specific person. Okay. One more book for you guys to read if you're so inclined. I'm sure Gerald has probably read it a couple of times. I've seen him in some of the seminars before. How are you guys enjoying the conference so far, and how is it being virtual?
Actually made it to more sessions this way because I didn't have to run around between sessions.
That's true.
It's exciting to think of it going worldwide also.
That is so
Yeah.
true. Yeah. I was really enjoying listening to apologetics for the kids with for my boys earlier today. So I was thinking that wouldn't have happened if I was traveling out there and being by myself.
Yes, I used that curriculum and passed it on to my daughter, and she's using it with our grandchildren.
Wow, that's great.
You're
Yeah.
still making a ton of noise.
Say that again, Mike? You're muted.
Sorry about that. I was talking to my wife.
Oh, okay. Bill has reminded us that less than 8 minutes is the next plenary session. So we should probably give you that time to stretch and get ready for it. Thank you all for your time. May the Lord bless you in your work and desires and prayers for the persecuted church, and may his kingdom continue to expand in our lives and others around us. Blessings.
Thank you. Good to see you.
You too, Gerald.
Thank you, Taher.
You're welcome, Mike. Did you want to hang on for a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah, I guess we can ask Kimberly about the, oh, sorry, Abigail, right? Not Kimberly. About the evaluation sheet. That would probably
Yeah.
be, I don't know how.
I'm assuming they'll send that out.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'm not sure how Spirit Media might be tracking, maybe through the registration, who exactly is attending these various seminars.
I'm kind of wondering how they're doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. But I'm sure they have a good system down pat, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm hoping that they have it all organized. I don't know. It depends upon what Zoom allows them to get the data from. So I can tell you had 27 people attending.
Right, I did see that in the.
And Christina said, thank you.
Okay.
Oh, you didn't include your email this time. Did you want to put your email?
Oh, I didn't, I guess. Yeah, sure. Gary had asked the question, is Gary still around? What the pseudonym actually means. Oh, it's Gerald actually. Oh, Gerald, it's actually the same meaning, pure heart. Joseph. I actually asked an Afghan friend of mine whether there's anything very close to, have I ever used a pseudonym when I've taught in the past? I don't know.
I don't think so. Not a connection, mission connection.
Oh, really? That's interesting. Okay. Yeah. I typed it, but it actually went to someone else, but now it's gone to you. So I actually asked one of my Afghan friends, and he said the closest thing he can think of is Taher. So I went with that. And I actually even started a Facebook page with that name, but I haven't used it too much. But there are certain conferences where I think that just comes in handy, just in case, things are published with my name on it. And it just becomes a difficult situation for the folks working in Afghanistan, So I think it's a good precaution to take.
Sure. Yeah, I was just curious how close it was to your name or something,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was telling my kids about it this morning, and they're like, "How did you come up with it?" I hadn't told them that I use a different name for some of these seminars. Yeah. Yeah.
So how would you pronounce it in in Afghan?
I think it would have a guttural ha to it. So Taher.
Higher? Yeah.
Yeah, I would have uh, I have, like, even when people say, the word Khan does not have a guttural tone to it in Sanskrit or Hindi, but actually the more the more west you go towards Middle East, that gets a little bit more guttural. And I've heard Afghans, the more rural you go, they actually don't say Khan, they say Khan, and the ha with the guttural noise stands out much more. So H has a different sort of sound to it than we are familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I lived in Central Asia,
Yeah.
and Taher would have been more vocalized with a longer,
Which sound?
R. Taher.
Okay. Yeah. I'm sure in that entire area, they probably make it sort of more of their own, and it's probably a common name. But I haven't actually come across that name much. But my dear Afghan friend
Yeah.
thought that's the closest thing you could translate Dulab to.
I've known at least two.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Oh, that's good to hear. Maybe it's more of a Central Asian name than, maybe it's more of a Tajik name more than it is a Pashto name, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, the maybe the Turkic root than the Persian root, maybe. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I need to explore that more.
So the Mughals originated from Uzbekistan, right?
The Mongols did?
Mughals.
Oh, the Mughals, yeah. Mughals, I think they have so many. I mean, I've come across more of present day Afghans, but also more Turkic and also one or two Persian. And I'm not sure how they categorize that now, because I think 500 years ago, they ruled early 11th century till mid 16th, I believe. And they would have obviously had different geopolitical lines, right? So I'm not sure whether they are now categorizing in today's world or what would have been. Dating back further, Persian Empire would have had a far-reaching stretch, right, in that area. So I hadn't heard of Uzbeks being part of the Mughals, but that's very, very possible, obviously.
Well, Tamerlane,
Uh-huh.
his great grandson was, I think, one of the first Mughals.
Okay. One of the ones, yeah, go ahead.
And the Mongols spread their empire east or west.
Mm-hmm.
So they were actually the progenitors of what is now Turkey.
Oh, interesting. So in Delhi, there's the tomb of a guy, Mughal emperor called Humayun. And turns out that he is the grandfather, if I'm not mistaken, of Shah Jahan, who is the creator of Taj Mahal. And
Right.
then
Okay.
is it Shah Jahan's son who was Akbar? I might have the sequence wrong, but anyway, Humayun and Shah Jahan. In fact, Shah Jahan kind of replicated the layout much more from Humayun's tomb. And Humayun, from all historical writings on him, sounds like more of Hazara, looks like a Hazara, the Mongolian descendant, and supposedly his family is descendants from the Herat area, which would have been just known as Persian Empire, right? So Herat is the bordering province to Iran in the west. So some of that stuff I started looking into after realizing the Mughals, when they ruled India, they kept Delhi as one of their main, ruling cities, and then down south in a city called Hyderabad, which recently became two different. I mean, you know a little bit from your travels and interactions. That recently shifted into two different states, but that has historically been a heavy Muslim city, and in fact, even dating as recent as early 1900s, one of the most prominent emperors or the kings of a regional king was also one of the most richest in historically and in the region, and he almost single-handedly helped Britain out of their economic trouble in the First World War. Can you believe that?
I heard that. Yeah.
So it's really interesting history that kind of connects back to the Mughal Empire.
Well, the interesting thing to me is you listen to people talk about immigration in America, and it's like going, you do realize immigration has been going on for thousands of years.
Yeah, I should have mentioned the fact that, if it wasn't for British, I wonder what the South Asian or the Central Asian context would be today, or the boundaries, right? So mostly in the late 1800s, my wife's paternal great grandmother was a Pashtun princess who just migrated down to present day Delhi region, which is obviously much more of a capital region for India as a country now over the past 70 years. But that migration would have been just in the same region back in that time, because, although, this is even before Afghanistan got its independence from Britain without a war. True war was fought out for it. Some Afghans think it was some treaty where some Afghans got some money or whatever it might be. But Pashtuns are very fierce, proud people as well. So they probably took care of those mountains, and it was probably very difficult for the Britishers to go up and down those mountains and fight these guys. So.
Well, they actually say that was one of the most difficult battles.
Yeah, historians say that there were three, but I can't even imagine what kind of battles they would have been, because there's such difficult frontiers. And one of the reasons why British never really came over certain mountainous regions, even within India, and the implication of that is very, very evident even within India. So they kind of stayed to the plains and went up the hills for retreat rather than actual fighting. But yeah, fun stuff. That's history.
Where did you live in the UK?
I lived in Cambridge the entire time we were there. I ended up doing a little bit of clinical work in London, a few hospitals in and around London, but most of the theoretical work and much of our life was in Cambridge itself. Really enjoyed it. I thought we talked about it earlier this week when we were talking.
We did a little bit, but I didn't remember you working in London too. What hospitals?
Yeah, I went to Ealing, was one of my longest ones. Hartford, Welland Garden City, and I finished one other place I can't think of. I only did like a month, the last one before coming back. I was hoping to finish everything there, and then even thinking and praying about going as a family to somewhere in Africa, but God had different plans. My visa didn't get renewed. We almost had to overnight rethink our plans. Came back to the States, had to finish off a few more preceptorship and clinical rotations here. Before going into family medicine.
Wow. That's interesting. I have a niece who's just become a PA.
Okay.
Wants to work overseas.
PAs, I would recommend PAs to do mission work because they have. I used to tell people to be as generalist as possible for mission work, but I've stopped giving that advice because the fact is God can use anyone. But the more general you are, then the more deeper you can go. But if you're super specialized, you get, just few people that come with that sort of problem. But even then, it comes down to relationships, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's all about relationships.
That's right. Yeah. I think our missional sort of trend has gone away from the discipleship model that Christ did so well.
Oh, I think for a while now, I've been thinking about people sitting there saying it's a trend in the last 100 years, 150 years, saying I was saved on a certain date, and this trend, I think, indicates to people, I was saved on this date, and for many people, that's the date that they can then live as they want, within the rules. Rather than sitting saying, I'm on a journey with Christ. And I think that's changed radically in how people think.
Yeah, it's such a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. I've been trying to find out when that was changed. I think it might have been with the Schofield Bible about the same time as when dispensationalism took hold.
Oh, right. Huh. Interesting. That's I keep using the word intersection because I'm doing a lot of reading and writing of a book on this idea where things shift in our cultural practices in different areas, whether it's medicine, religion, all these different practices. So I think that's something that I'd love to look into. If you have any articles or suggestions of books, I'd love to look at that.
Let me think about that.
Okay. Gerald, give us a update on what you've been up to, brother.
Just normal work these days. Haven't been out of the country or anything. For
Yeah.
quite a while.
You used to do some mission trips, right?
Yeah, short-term trips to India and more recently Lebanon. So that's been my. You were talking about refugees. I mean, the Lebanese, the Syrians in Lebanon was the same kind of thing where they had once basically ruled the country.
Yeah.
Before the war and after the Civil War, back as the poorest refugees there. It's kind of the same. And I know some of the Lebanese believers, actually had family members that were killed by Syrians, during Civil War, and now they're ministering to them. It's pretty amazing to see.
Who did you work with in Lebanon?
Heart for Lebanon. The last 3 times I went was the primary, and also Youth for Christ. And then we had other groups who were actually working with a number of other, Rhonda Blay and several others. I can't even remember them all. Some of the other sub teams.
Okay. I have a good friend. Well, I haven't seen him in years, but who was the primary sponsor for Samaritan's Purse in Lebanon. He's Lebanese. His wife is American.
Interesting. I never ran into them there. I actually ran into them in India after the Gujarat earthquake. Helped them out with computer problems, and that's my thing is the computer.
You're right. Yeah.
I'll get some photos off a laptop that was dying. I was back when I was in college or even high school, I met a man who was an older man at that time, who had been a tea trader in Afghanistan in like the 1940s as a tent maker and missionary. I mean, that was the only way to get in there, I guess, back then.
Yeah.
And I don't remember his name right now. I probably got it written down somewhere, but
So this is probably before the J. Christian
1940.
Wilson time. Yeah, 40s. There's some reference to some trade evangelist in one of Wilson's books. I should look back at it to see. There are some knowledge of very few instances mentioned in any Western writings. Certainly, they probably wouldn't have. The church in Afghanistan, as we know it now, they've only really been systematic about some of these things since early part of last decade. Sorry, early part, maybe even, I want to say, little as I know, maybe in 2008, they formed a Great Commission Council, so they call GCC. So that was led by locals, and they have a little bit of the history written out, but I doubt that many of them know what God was doing, and in terms of people sharing the gospel, even into the middle part of the 20th century.
Yeah, I don't remember, what kind of results there were there, if that was just early planting seeds or what, but
Yeah.
kind of interesting.
Some what's that again?
I just thought it was interesting that somebody had done something that radical. I mean, that, to try to reach an.
At the same time, back then, I don't think, even in the story that I shared in the beginning, I forgot to mention that a good 5 minutes of the conversation with the tribal elder was actually about the last foreigner that he had seen, and happened to be a young Canadian woman, kind of following that hippie trail, through the Khyber Pass, those Hindu Kush mountains. So I bet you, dating back to the 40s, when stability was then certainly what they were experiencing, people might not have necessarily looked upon the gospel as something that was truly offensive. They would have probably argued with you, but certainly the way it has turned out now, in terms of it quickly becoming an offensive thing, I would think that's much more, even as you look at the whole movement within the Muslim Brotherhood, collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and then onwards, you see a lot more of this fanaticism, fundamentalism growing within the Islamic tradition. That was not the case before that, so
after colonialism.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. I think maybe even the advancement of many of the Middle Eastern countries to see countries as their own sort of entities have kind of led to some tension between their own countries, right? So it's an interesting phenomenon that we've been seeing over the past 50, 60 years, much more than before that.
I think you see the same thing in America.
How so, Michael?
The crazy fanatics who.
It's getting more and more polarized.
Yeah.
Mm.
And they say that they're Christian or whatever. That only feeds Satan. But they claim to be Christian, and majority of the Christians don't actually acknowledge them. I think you find the same thing. I mean, in many places around the world, you find the extreme have more voice than the non-extreme.
Yeah. Definitely louder. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I was just going to say, when there's a lot more emphasis on what are the specific things that distinguishes us, and we forget about the deeper spiritual issues that should unite us, hopefully.
Yeah. A lot of things that should unite, but sometimes allow people to divide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I guess we should head out to, I might try out the plenary session, which I believe is already started.
Yeah, I think I want to head to that too. So it's been great to see you again.
Yeah,
Yes.
you too, Carol. Yeah, hopefully we'll meet again in person soon. Thanks a lot, Michael.
Okay.
Thanks.
God bless.
We'll be in
Bye.
touch. Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye.